Record. Okay, so we're recording this meeting so that everyone knows. Okay, welcome everyone to the monthly Breakfast for Dispute Resolvers, co-sponsored by the Association for Conflict Resolution of Greater New York and the City University of New York Dispute Resolution Center at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. I'm Maria Volpe. I'm a professor at John Jay and the director of the dispute resolution program there. I want to thank our team for making this possible every month. Julie Denny, Chuck Newman, Matthew Latimer, and Nikki Borofsky. I started these breakfasts after 9/11 in the aftermath of the tragedy at the World Trade Center. We have continued them. Today is number 227. Since we've always met in person at John Jay College since 9/11, but since April, we have been meeting online. So this is our fourth virtual breakfast. The impact of the COVID-19 health crisis and the fight for racial justice are palpable, not only in the larger society, but in our field. And I think that both provide us with challenges and opportunities. And it's our responsibility to try to figure out how we deal with those challenges and how we find the opportunities, particularly with the fight for racial justice. How do we create a more welcoming, inclusive field and a pathway forward? And today's discussion, I think, provides us with that opportunity to think about the creative ways for us to deal with some of the challenges that we always see in this field. I know that David Smith, our speaker this morning, has spent many years now thinking about how to create opportunities for us to navigate the employment world. Many of you see those postings that I put up periodically on the listserv, encouraging everyone to think creatively about the field. And David often responds that, in fact, we do have to think out of the box. How can we apply our skills in every field? Our skills and knowledge are universal. There is no magical formula. But in fact, I think if we continue our creative venture, we can make a difference, and not only in the world, but also think about how we can be a more inclusive field of everyone. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Julie, who's going to introduce David. Thank you, David, for joining us from
Very pleased to be here.
Maryland. And Julie, it's your turn to introduce.
Just to say that David Smith, who's zooming in from Rockville, Maryland, has a long list of credentials. We're delighted that he's here. I'm just going to give you some of them. He's president of the Forage Center for Peace Building and Humanitarian Education, which is an organization that offers experiential learning opportunities for students and for professionals. He's taught at Goucher College, Towson University, Georgetown University, Drexel, and currently he's at the Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution at George Mason University. He was a founding member of the Harford County, that's in Maryland, Community Mediation Commission. He was a Fulbright Scholar working in Estonia. He's won the William Kreidler Award for Distinguished Service to the Field of Conflict Resolution, which was an ACR award. And the list goes on. He's an author. He's written legal research and writing. He is also an attorney. He's editor of Peace Building and Community Colleges. And he's eminently qualified to address us today as we try to find ways to think creatively out of the box when it comes to conflict resolution. One operational note, once again, we're not going to use the chat function. We're going to use the hand raising function. David's going to speak for 25, 30 minutes, and then we'll open it up and we'll call, or David will call on hand raises. And you do that by putting your finger over your image. Up will come the triple dot more option. And if you open that and click on your name, you will see raise hand, and you click on that. And that will appear on the side of David's screen, and he will know that you have a question. We're trying to avoid the chat function because many people have found it distracting. People start promoting their own services, they get off on sidetracks, and everybody sees it, and it gets too busy. Okay, so David, take it over.
Thank you. Can everyone see my screen first of all?
Not yet.
Not yet. We see
Okay.
that you're going to share.
Okay. Tell me when it arrives.
Not yet.
The sharing has been paused. Bring your window to the front. Okay, now you
There
see
you go.
it.
There
Okay,
you go.
great. So thank you, Julie, for the kind words, and thank you, Maria, for the introduction. I have been a big fan and supporter of this listserv for probably the last 10 years that I've been on it, and I just think it's such an important opportunity for the greater conflict, peace building community to get together. So I really want to thank Maria for all of her efforts. What I want to do is just in the beginning, build a little bit about the profile that Julie put out there about my background. One of the things that I always remind my own students is that really know where your presenter, your speaker is coming from, know about their background before you listen in, because that will cue you into their, well, maybe their biases, maybe their perspective, maybe if they have a shred of wisdom, where that wisdom is coming from. So as Julie was saying, I started my career as a lawyer back in the late 1980s. I was an attorney outside of Baltimore in Towson. I'd gone to University of Baltimore Law School, and I started a private practice. And my focus was family law. So I was a divorce lawyer back in the late 1980s. Not too long into my practice, which was a lot of custody work before domestic masters, I started to realize this is just not working. This is just not the way it should be done. It was about that time that the field of conflict resolution, of course, as lawyers, we knew it as ADR, was kind of getting its legs. And I took a divorce mediation course in Maryland with Martin Kranitz. Some of you may know Martin. This was about 1989 or so. And I was just taken in by this as an approach to dealing with family issues. The problem is no one else believed that, in the legal community. So starting a family practice, family mediation practice in the late 1980s outside of Baltimore probably met with the same type of resistance that you were feeling, those of you who were starting then also. It took a number of years, and I started to convince my colleague lawyers that I wasn't taking your clients away. I was providing an alternative. I started getting involved in, I think about 1990, we formed an ADR committee in our bar association and started to recognize that this was an alternative. At the time, probably in my community, there were 5 or 6 of us that were doing it. This is a county of 750,000 people and in a bar of 10 or 15,000, but just a handful of mediators. I made a little bit of a turn at some point and went into academia and taught at a community college. Actually, I ran a paralegal studies program for about 10 years. So there's another intersection with some of you who have your own practices and hire paralegals. But what happened was I stopped the family law work, even though I really enjoyed it, and really turned my direction to community mediation. And I was asked by the county executive where I was teaching to help form a community mediation program. So myself and a group of 3 or 4 other colleagues really stepped up and set up a community mediation program in our county. Some community mediation programs are kind of standalone, not-for-profits. Some of them are tied to government, if you will. Ours was tied to government. And I was part of that for many years, doing my own community mediation. Teaching, I started teaching some conflict resolution courses. Wasn't really a lot going on back then. I also recognized that my interest in the domestic work that I was doing and the community mediation work was now being transformed and looking at more of a global level. So in 2003, and a lot of this was brought on probably about because of 9/11, I really felt like I needed to be more in the international perspective of things. I was awarded a Fulbright grant, and I taught ADR and peace studies at the University of Tartu in Estonia. So I spent a semester teaching conflict resolution to graduates, to law students in Estonia. And that really opened up my eyes to certainly international perspectives and what people were thinking around the world, and how conflict resolution could be used in kind of multicultural context. Came back to my college, realized that that wasn't necessarily the right fit, and kind of made two decisions. One was that I needed to go back to school. As a lawyer with a JD who had taken ADR training, I felt like I had developed pretty good techniques. I was competent as a lawyer. I was enjoying practicing law, but as I was getting more and more into mediation and conflict work, I started to realize that what was really important for me at this point was going deeper into the nature of conflict, really understanding why we are in conflict. What are the forces that drive people to take different paths, right? What are the underlying sources of differences? And what I found is through that experience, I went back and got a master's degree. I actually started a PhD program at George Mason, ended up with a master's degree, is for me to recognize that understanding why people come to the table in a deeper way made me a better mediator, and made me also recognize that there are many ways of intervening in conflict beyond mediation. At the same time, I went to work for the U.S. Institute of Peace in Washington. So the U.S. Institute of Peace, USIP, is an international based, but funded by the federal government, conflict resolution organization that looks at peace building and conflict resolution around the world and works in conflict zones, does not work in the United States. So I started to get a recognition of what was going on around the world. So up to that point then, I'd had kind of in a way, the multi-dimensional understanding of conflict, looking at it internationally when I was at USIP, looking at it in a domestic way when I was doing family law, and maybe looking at it a community way when I was doing community mediation. And one of the things that always struck me was recognizing that we have more that is similar than dissimilar. Often those people who do the international might not recognize the value that a community mediator brings to an experience. And somebody who's a community or family mediator might not recognize what they can offer in an international context. So one of the things I've always argued over my career is that intersectionality that's so very important and that we offer across the board. And it's again gotten me to think over the years of what people can do in the field. A little bit more about what I do right now, and then I'll go into my talk, is we are the Carter Center effective yesterday. Used to be the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason. And starting July 1st, we are now the Jimmy and Rosalind Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution. I take great pride in that. I've always been have a great respect for Jimmy Carter, particularly in his work with the Carter Center. And it is a testament to his many years of work, not only when he was president and bringing about the Camp David Accords, but particularly his work since then. So I teach as an adjunct there, and I teach mostly master's and PhD students. I taught courses such as reflective practice. Last semester I taught a course in facilitation, and it was many of you are faculty. We started the semester in class, which is the best way of teaching facilitation because I use a very experiential approach. Halfway through, we are now in Blackboard teaching and trying to create facilitation simulations through Blackboard. And I must tell you, it worked. It was a little clunky at first. I struggled as much as, and maybe more than my students, but it can be done. It can be done. In the fall, I think we're still going to be doing a lot of things virtual through Blackboard. I also teach there's a career course that we offer for our master's degree students that I run. I also have a small NGO that does humanitarian education training. So my other hand, or my other foot, we'll say, is involved in looking at preparing professionals to work in conflict zones internationally. So we have a training center, we run experiential training for that. And then finally, as a consultant, I do a lot of one-on-one career coaching with people who are looking at moving into various, we'll say, conflict, peace building, international. I work with lots of lawyers who are trying to make transitions also. So a little bit about what I do. My wife is an academic. She teaches a community college, teaches nursing. I said my son is an engineer, but he was in the Peace Corps, so I have an understanding of that. And I have a daughter who's an early childhood education major, wants to be a kindergarten teacher. And we're trying to figure out how she's going to do her student teaching in the fall. So we don't know how that's going to happen yet. So yet to be seen. So let me first start off by tipping my hat, let me move the next slide, to Maria. And one of the things, as Maria was saying, is that she does this frequently, which I really like that she does this, is reminding all of us that when we think about the work that we do, we have to think much broadly than often our own identities, right? We have identities as a mediator, as a lawyer, and sometimes those are limiting, and we have to think about the places in which conflict exists. And it's like, where doesn't conflict exist, right? So one of the things for us to think about is that conflict is ubiquitous, and our work thus is ubiquitous. And particularly as we become a more diverse, a more varied, different expectations, we have an obligation to help people work through differences, right? Conflict comes with diversity, and diversity is a wonderful thing, but what it does is it requires us to up our game and to recognize that we really need to be in that mix in many different ways. And there are many, many, many different occupations, fields, jobs that they need people to work on conflict. So you might say, well, this doesn't really have anything to do with being a mediator, but maybe it does. I think we have, those of us who are maybe my age, to remember when we had TV repairmen, right? My mother was a travel agent. Try to find a travel agent today, right? And my father ran a letterpress, a printing press. You know, I mean, we all probably all have parents who are doing things that, where'd those jobs go, right? And you know, in the last 20 years, maybe in the last 20 months, maybe the last 20 weeks, right? You know, who knew there were such things as COVID tracers? Have you ever heard of that job before 4 months ago, right? Jobs are changing. We don't really know what people are going to be doing in the future. And that includes us. That includes us who work in conflict. We don't know what those jobs are going to be called. We're not so sure what those jobs are going to be doing, where we're going to be able to place our skills. So what that means is that we have to be prepared to kind of open ourselves up to the possibility, to move away kind of from stringent kind of expectations that may often restrict how we think, to being open and being more creative and thinking about where our work may be useful and can be applied. So one of the things that I like to start off with is defining work and thinking about what we do. And I really come to thinking that there are kind of two ways in which we kind of frame what we do. One is in what I would say is maybe a more limited, more traditional way, right? So we think of ourselves as ADR people, alternative dispute resolution, right? And so that's the term that is used in, you know, the vernacular that's used in the legal community. It's the vernacular that is used in organizations. It is it's a shorthand that we feel comfortable with. It has its role, but it's somewhat limiting in a sense, because we're kind of suggesting that dispute resolution is everything that happens. And it's often been limited by the occupation that kind of works in that area. So mediation is in a way is coming to be thought of as a more limited way of looking at things. It's very traditional. Mediators do certain things. realizing that there are various different forms of mediation, right? So some people, look at mediation as a very, transformative experience. Some people don't. It's still getting to be a traditional way of conceptualizing our work. Likewise, arbitration, if we continue down the scale of other types of conflict resolution, negotiation, conflict management, conflict resolution, those are actually two very different terms in the field, though we tend to recognize them as the same sometime. Management is actually what a lot of us are doing. We're helping our clients recognize that as they go through life, they're going to have to continue to manage this thing, whatever it may be. This divorce, you're not going to be married anymore, but you're still going to be parents, as you will. So it's really a matter, and there are other kind of more traditional ways that we look at it. But what I've come to think is that there may be kind of broader ways in which we can consider, and more contemporary ways we can consider, that I think we're seeing more and more often being looked at. So for instance, looking at, online dispute resolution, right? Boy, how many times have you gotten emails lately about how to learn how to do it, right? I work with the folks at mediate.com, and everybody's got a session on, moving from a traditional practice to an online practice. And I think for a lot of us in the conflict resolution community, we have not been real receptive to that at times, because one of our premises and one of the things that become really important to us is the humanistic nature of what we do, right? Sitting down, looking into the eye of a disputant, right? Reading the subtle cues that somebody brings to the table, their body movements, the change in tone, the way they sit, the way they react. These become really important observational cues for a mediator in order to do their best work. Does that exist in online dispute resolution? Well, maybe yes and maybe no, but it's really getting us to recognize that maybe we need to be looking for different things. But the horse is out of the barn, so to speak, right? And many of us have to recognize that even though it may not be where we want to go, it's where the field is going. Looking at dialogic processes. So for instance, a lot of what mediation is kind of a dialogue, right? But what we're doing is we're in situations where we need to have broader dialogues. If you think about what's going on around the country with the protests and the need for social justice, we're really kind of, the means to that is often creating more means for dialogue. So a lot of people that are really doing dialogue work really is an extension of social justice work, right? And the fact that sitting down and getting people at a table, metaphorically, because it may be out in the middle of the street, not so much at the table, to have a conversation, to have that important chat that they need, right? To have that conversation. Sometimes we go right to the agreement, but we have to have the chat, becomes really important. And that becomes something that is very much, and can very much be in our wheelhouse. It doesn't squarely fit into mediation. It doesn't squarely fit into negotiation, but it is more contemporary of what our needs might be. The term peace building, which I'll talk about later on, is increasingly being used to describe the umbrella of means that are used to bring peace, stability, sustainability into communities, right? So where I come from at the Carter School and the work that I've done at USIP, we've kind of embraced that. Traditionally, it was more a lot of it in international context, but now we're starting to recognize that peace building is something that is the broader notion of what goes on in building communities. But I see a lot of mediators using the term peacemaking now and talking about what they do, is that they're peacemakers. They're not mediators, they're helping people make peace. And that becomes important also. You know, one of the challenges with American society is that we've often been kind of resistant to using the word peace at times. We've kind of, attribute to kind of a political notion to it. And, that just kind of reflects our cultural and political history. But that's not how the rest of the world looks at peace. And peace is something that really has an objective frame as less than a political frame at times. So being a peacemaker and people bringing people to tables is very important. Conflict transformation. So this term, I would say, is being much more considered in the work that we do as a juxtaposition to conflict resolution and management, right? So conflict transformation speaks to the idea that what we're doing is transforming relationships as a mediator, as a conflict professional. And the classic example is that you and your wife may not be married, but you're going to be parents the rest of your life. So aren't we really just looking to transform the relationship into something else? We're looking at the relationship, not the problem, if you will, and doing it that way. And then finally, this notion of facilitation. Increasingly, what we're doing is we're facilitating conversations with people, right? As a community mediator, which I still do, the last community mediation is I had to facilitate a room of 50 people in having a conversation about traffic in the city. But think about it in the context of the issues that we're dealing now in social justice, right? And the things that we can bring to the table in that way in facilitating larger conversations. So then that leads me to thinking about the work or the workers of conflict resolution. And here, often we think in terms of two different ways in which we view what we do. And sometimes we are one or the other, sometimes we're a little bit of both, but it's important for us to recognize where we are at a particular time. So often we look at identity. And identity is, I am a, right? So think about how you introduce yourself, right? Think about being at a cocktail party. Of course, they're virtual now, or a barbecue. I don't know if any of you are having barbecues this weekend. Make sure you're socially distancing and wearing masks. But, you know, Americans typically get to that conversation really quickly. And it's kind of unfortunate times, but it's like, so what do you do? And what do you do is defined by, well, I'm a mediator, right? I'm an arbitrator. I'm a negotiator, right? Rather than looking at the function of what we do, right? And the difference in looking at the function is that we're not really defined by a job description as much as what we bring to the table. So I facilitate, right? But me being able to facilitate doesn't mean I'm a mediator, doesn't mean I'm an arbitrator, doesn't mean I'm a lawyer. It just means that what I do is I facilitate, I mediate. Doesn't mean that I'm in that identity as a mediator as much as this is what I do, I mediate, right? I build peace is what I do, right? How many of you introduce yourselves rather than saying, I'm a mediator, would introduce yourselves and say, what I do is I build peace, right? I negotiate. And probably most importantly is I help people with conflict. You know, think about the next time you're introducing yourself to somebody who asks, well, what's your gig? What is it that you do? Rather than saying, I'm a mediator, saying, I help people with conflict. If you change the way that you look and turn it in a functional way, then I think what you're doing is you're offering yourselves to a broader audience and allows you to think about where that work can happen. So this leads me to thinking about a few myths and that I think are myths. And they're myths not because the statement in of itself doesn't resonate, but it means that we're often not able to go beyond the statement to figure out what we can do about it in order to empower the work that we do and think about where we can do it. One is, there's not enough business for the number of people engaged in the work. That's the supply and demand, right? We're always talking about that. All these mediators out there, not enough work, right? I get trained, I can't use any of it. You know, people, I mean, I remember the days when it was, is it meditation or is it mediation that you do, right? It's lately, I've gotten actually into meditation for the first time in my life. But this idea of supply and demand is often an issue that we focus on. And one of the challenges for us is that we actually don't know how to make the case for prevention. That is, when we talk about the business, what we're talking about is the conflict at its eruption point. There's not enough of that to match the number of mediators. And maybe when that happens, we're hightailing it to the court system rather than thinking in terms of the prevention that we could be engaged with and making the argument for that. There are lots of things that never happen because they're prevented. Are they prevented by mediators? Are they prevented by other people? I don't know, but we definitely play a role in that. So if we could cast in what we do more in terms of prevention and search out opportunities for there, would there be more work for us? This idea of community building in and of itself, right? Everything that we're seeing right now in terms of social justice really at its core has to do with community building. Community building between law enforcement and communities, looking within communities themselves. These are all things that are in the front end of conflict. Those are things that we can do and we can be engaged in to create the opportunities for ourselves. And then this one I think is the most intriguing. finding the intersectionality of things that are coming. Daniel Pink, who's a writer based in Washington, he's written a number of books. Drive, I think, is most famous, talks about boundary crossers, people who can see two different areas and can find the intersection of them in order to go forward, right? We need to be in that intersectionality. You know, are we as conflict resolution people dealing with science? Are we dealing with business needs? Are we dealing with things that are just arising that we recognize there will be conflict in, right? How many of us are in the midst of dealing with helping school and colleges and universities figure out what their fall looks like? No one's going to tell me there isn't going to be conflict come August, right? So how many of us are offering our time and going to university and saying, you want to have a community meeting with your students and with your parents to decide when you're going to open up and what that's going to look like? Here I am. We're not doing that, I think. We need to be into that. One of the best examples, and this is more of a global example, but some of you may appreciate this, is that 20 years ago, no one would have thought that migration, the need for migration and migration itself, and climate change would have come to an intersection, right? But now we recognize as the climate changes, it affects where people are living. So as the seas rise and people need to move out of their coastal cities, as the deserts get larger and people need to move out, what you're finding is climate and migration is creating this intersectionality that people need to step in order to help the lives and bettering the lives and improving conditions. We have to be like that as conflict people, find where those intersections are. I need to have training certification before I can do the work, right? So this is also part of this notion that there is something that I have to do in order to do it, right? And I recognize I'm not against certification or training. I think that that's necessary. One of the things that I'm concerned about is that what do we do with the natural, right? There are people who are natural mediators. We know them. Some of them are us, some of them are not us. We know people who just do this really well and they're good at it. And do we say, we don't want you because you know, you haven't gone through the training I have? Or do we help bring them in a different way and we support them and try to find a way for them? I'm worried about this, systemic exclusion based on privilege, right? So as a mediation community, as a conflict resolution community, sometimes we're not as diverse as we should be. And the ways that we've gotten to where we are really have to do with traditional education, of which is embedded some levels of structural hierarchy and privilege, right? We all went to law school, we got master's degrees in social work, we're PsyD, we did all these things. And then we had the opportunity, maybe the privilege, to get some certification and to take more training. And here we are. And some of us will say, well, we were just lucky. We know we weren't just lucky. We know that there's a system in which we've stepped on those shoulders to get what we're getting. If we think about training and certification the same way, are we excluding some people as a result of the requirements for that? Are we creating newer, should we be creating different pathways? And of course, on-the-job training has its value also. People know they need my help and will find me. This is the third myth I see, right? So it's like, if I offer it, they will come, right? If I put out my shingle, people know they're a mediator, they'll know to come to me. Well, you know, there's a bit of cognitive dissonance that a lot of people feel when they have conflict. I got a problem, so I should do something about it. I'm not going to do anything about it, right? And they kind of struggle with that. And they don't naturally recognize that there is a way of doing it. Maybe the lawyer is the natural way. And so the struggle they never quite resolve when it comes to it, right? People have a fear to admit failure, need, and vulnerability. I mean, one of the things to recognize is going to a mediator admits vulnerability, right? What you're doing is you're saying, I'm vulnerable at this point, right? And so I'm needing help. And a lot of people, it's a very hard thing for people to recognize. And then finally, unable to accurately self-diagnose. So this is not the finest, one more. So people can't self-diagnose themselves. We're terrible. We were terrible at that generally, right? Figuring out what our own problem is. We have to go to a specialist, but people can't do it. You know, it says, yeah, I'm having problems with my husband, or I'm having problems at work, but it's not really that big of a deal. I can get through it, right? And so if people can't diagnose themselves to the point where they seek out help, the help will never be there. And often, we've seen this, when they end up dealing with the problem is out of control, and we as mediators can help, right? We recognize that there is, what we'll say is a point, is an opportunity point, right? Is what we call the herding stalemate sometimes, of when we can play a role. If we get beyond that, we can't come back, in a sense, right? And often it's when we see people or hear about things, you know, every domestic violence that takes place, there was a point 6 weeks before then where conflict resolution could have been useful. The problem, it wasn't. And now 6 weeks later, somebody is seriously hurt, right? What could we have done as a community before that in order to make a difference? And then finally, just cultural expectation, right? So this other thing is that there's an expectation. There's not an expectation of going to a mediator. Maybe there is, maybe there's not. It's not what you do. You go to a lawyer or you go to the police, right? One of the things that I think is really promising is the way we're reconsidering policing today. And I've been reading a lot about this, urged on by my 26-year-old son, who has some really strong points of view on this. One of the ways we're reconsidering policing is what's the role of mediators in conflict resolution in policing. Now, recognizing that some police do have training in conflict resolution, but more don't. Is there a role that as first responders, people who do our work can show up, maybe before the traditional law enforcement shows up, right? And thinking about that. So thinking now about getting into the work itself, what do we do? So there would be, based on that, there are kind of two ways of looking at it, right? One is what I would say is the careers approach, right? Based on identity. So, you know, you're a newly minted, maybe you're calling yourself a mediator. You're saying, I'm this mediator and this is what I want to do and so forth. So, you know, job title, mediator, right? This is what Maria often talks about. If you're just looking for that job called mediator, you aren't going to find it. And if you find it, you're probably not going to be qualified for it. So what you've got to do is you've got to find that job that's called community development or something else, right? Where, oh, one of the jobs and skills is knowing conflict resolution. We are still, though, fixated a little bit on finding that job, right? Because we often feel our identity is tied up in that job. You know, when you're a lawyer, you spend a lot of time going to law school, passing the bar. I'm a lawyer. I want you to respect me for being a lawyer, right? And mediators, you know, we go through similar training experience, so that identity and looking for that job title. Of course, there's the lawyer, Indian chief. This is a Barbara Hutton song from the 1940s, is that we are then going into that kind of classification that there is all these different people, and we've got to fit into one of that classification. We've got to be a somebody, right? We've got to be a doctor, a lawyer, Indian chief, right? And of course, in our society, there was traditionally a hierarchy of prestige, right? You know, every mom and dad wants their kid to be a doctor. And if you're not going to be a doctor, at least go to law school, right? Kind of a thing, right? So that becomes important to people also. If I only had a hammer, everything's a nail. We've heard that, right? And one of the challenges, especially for mediators sometimes, is that your identity is wrapped up with a certain specific set of skills, right? You know how to do mediation, you know it very well. But once again, that's your hammer, right? If you remember the song, If I Had a Hammer, I'm hammering all day long. I'm hammering in the morning, I'm hammering in the evening. I may be hammering to put out social justice, but I'm still using a hammer, right? Are there other things that I could be doing to put out social justice? And sometimes our identity limits us to doing only the hammer. It's also the curse of specialization. I refinished a book, I don't know if people, When Breath Becomes Air by Paul Kalanithi. Paul was a young intern doctor, passed away, I guess, 5 or 6 years ago, and he wrote a memoir. He died of cancer in his 30s. And I read the book as part of the book club that I'm in, a men's book club, and we have books. I don't know how many people are doing book clubs right now, but I'm finding it fascinating. And I really enjoy it. So there's a scene in the book where he's got, if the diagnosis is bad, right? And so all the doctors come in, the oncologist, the radiologist, the this, the that, the this, the that, the this, the that. They can't agree what to do. And they all have a different way of doing it. Nobody's in charge, right? And so think about it. It's the divorce lawyer, it's the mediator, it's the psychotherapist. Nobody's in charge. And so the client, in his case, he's a doctor, so he actually gets in charge and decides what to do. But one of the things about specialization is that when you have too much specialization, including with mediators, you don't have a person who can see everything and can bring things together. And so that's the curse of specialization. And I think we've all been in situations where, you know, our doctor doesn't give us our advice, so we go to a different specialty and we hear different advice. Then we go to a different specialty and we get different advice. The mediator is going to tell you one thing. The litigator is going to tell you something different. Who do you listen to, right? And that becomes a challenge. Versus what I would call is the skills approach. It's more function-based, right? Thinking about what we're doing in terms of tailoring our skills to a demand. Rather than saying there's a job called mediator, there are skills that I can apply in a particular circumstance, right? Acting in the moment. A skills function approach allows us to act in the moment. You know, too often what you find is we've got a problem, we got to call the mediator. But if the problem is right now, can't call the mediator and have him come in next week. We got to do something right now. It's all about being in the moment, right? And so if you're working somewhere where you have that conflict resolution ability and skills, you can act in the moment. You can do that necessary. Maybe it's triage based, maybe it's first aid, however way you look at it. You don't have to say, oh, send these people back to their office, have them cool off. We'll bring in a mediator and set up a session on Tuesday, right? You can't wait till Tuesday. By Tuesday, there's a lawsuit. By Tuesday, somebody's quit. By Tuesday, something else has happened. So by taking a function approach of what you can do, you can act then and there. So wherever you work, if you've got that ability and you can do something there and then, you're really doing something great for where you are. Encourages reflective practice. So one of the things that I think is really important with people who do conflict work is going through the reflective practice notion of what we do. So we have to reflect on what we do, and sometimes we have to do it continuously. It's in the moment, right? There's a process through experiential learning in which we realize that we have to change course. I mean, we've all sat in mediation sessions where we've said, oh, that was the wrong thing for me to say, right? Or I was thinking about doing that, but what she just said really is causing me to think about something different than I'd planned. And it's not, you can't say, let's take a 15-minute recess and I'm going to think about this. Or come back next week because I got to think this through. You've got to reflect right then and there and come up with something, right? Once again, if you think about the skill that you have rather than the occupation, you're able to pivot. Pivoting on a dime is something that mediators and conflict people should be good at. You can do that. Ability to diagnose and prevent, right? If you have a function approach, if you're in a situation where you have the skill, you have an ability to diagnose and prevent then and there, rather than calling in that mediator or putting it back and putting it for a different time, because often it's then and there when you have to do it, right? Developing skills, awareness, not preparing for an occupation. You're not preparing for an occupation here. You're developing skills and awareness that you can apply. That becomes really important. And finally, recognizes the ubiquitous nature of conflict, right? So if conflict is everywhere, conflict resolvers need to be everywhere, right? Everybody needs to do it, right? It's a little bit like reading across the curriculum. And it's not to say that there isn't training that's necessary. It doesn't mean that, you know, you can't have a degree. It just means that you need to be more focused on the function of what you do and where you do it, regardless of the job, rather than thinking I have to be the mediator from the outside that they bring in, right? And when something's ubiquitous, it's there all the time and we have to face it all the time. And then finally, the reality of mainstreaming, right? The trend is mainstreaming of what we do. I know there are always going to be a cadre of people who are mediators, and I think that that's important. But increasing what we're recognizing is that in all disciplines, people are studying about conflict. We just don't own it ourselves. You can go to an MBA program and you can take a course in conflict resolution. You can go into a psych program and take a course in conflict resolution. You can go into an emergency management program and take a course in conflict resolution. I dare say you can be an accountant and take a course in conflict resolution, because those fields all recognize that accountants, emergency management people, psychologists, everybody needs to know conflict resolution because it's everywhere. It's just not for us. It's got to be everywhere, and we have to act that way. This is a chart that I put together for a book that I wrote a couple of years ago, and just something else for you to think about in the work that you do. And then at the end of this, I've got a list of recommendations I'm making for what people can do. So don't think I'm just putting these points. I got one more slide that we'll spend some time with, and then we'll take questions. But one is one of the things I always remind people is that conflict operates in what we do in 3 different levels. It operates in the micro level when we're working with people one-on-one. It works in the meso level when we're working with people in groups. And I think, for instance, the social justice movements that are happening right now is really meso level conflict resolution, right? We can be dealing with people on a one-on-one level, but we're dealing with large groups of people, movements, causes, things are happening. And then there's the macro, which we often think about as the global. Often we think about direct action, right? Being the mediator, being the arbitrator, somebody who does it, being the diplomat, versus what I would say is indirect action. That is the teacher who could do conflict resolution, the community organizer who can do conflict resolution, right? The whatever who can do it, right, is really where the need's going to be. And particularly in a time like now, right? You think about where some of the protests have really, where there's been a tremendous effort for it to be a nonviolent protest and a peaceful protest, it's gone off the rails for some reason. And because it's gone off the rails, there has been the need for people to intercede there at times and to bring it back on the rails. And often there may not be people there who can do that. That's indirect conflict, that's indirect action. That's a community leader or somebody who can step in and say, how do we move it? That's street negotiation. That's very important conflict resolution work. So thinking about that. When I wrote my book a couple of years ago, I was always struck by this quote, and I haven't forgotten it, and I actually use it a lot. And this just reminds us, and it really continues kind of Maria's points that she always make about, you know, we used to think about IT people as geeky people who did code and that kind of stuff. And, you know, they didn't have any humanistic qualities and, you know, they had the pens in their shirt pocket. I mean, I'm creating a stereotype here, so I apologize. But one of the things we have to recognize is that people who work in IT want to hire people who can negotiate and empathy and teamwork, because that's how you help a person with their problems, right? That's how you get them to figure out what they can do. That's where you can help them work through the conflict that they're having. So one of the things to think about is that the array of fields that we can be in which we can do this work are broad. This chart here, and then I'll go to the slide with the recommendations, is just something that I show, and I continue to show it because it still resonates. This is what's called the Strategic Peacebuilding Pathways, and was developed by John Paul Lederach and Katie Mansfield at the University of Notre Dame a number of years ago. And it's really John Paul Lederach, and some of you probably read Lederach. It's an elicitive model, and by that it means he didn't really kind of create it. They actually went to students and said, what are you doing? And thinking about, once again, I talked about this umbrella of peace building and defining it, of all the things that are part of that. And if you look at the work that falls on the outside of this ring, right? Dialogue, conflict resolution strategies, nonviolent social change, education, development. Certainly a lot of these speak to the international, and in fact, I've framed it more in an international context. But all of these work in the domestic context also. Think about community development work, right? Think about money that goes to a community, maybe through a business process, maybe through some other process that is going to, you know, up the game in a community and, you know, build a shopping center, promote schools, create more jobs, that kind of thing. That's conflict resolution work, I would tell you, really. Because what you're doing is you're preventing conflict by creating more opportunity for people, right? You're creating more livable space for people. You're creating and you're empowering people, right? You think about humanitarian action. We think about it kind of in a global, but if you work for FEMA or you work for the Red Cross and you're going to a disaster, you're dealing with people who potentially could be in conflict, right? And often are beside themselves in what to do, right? That's conflict resolution work also. So it's back to this notion of kind of framing out a little bit more about what we do becomes really valuable to our work. All right. So here is what I would say are things that you can do to prepare. And this is the, I think I might have one slide after this, but this is the slide we want to kind of give you ideas and then take questions. So a couple things. One is I would say seek opportunities where an array of skills are employed, right? So if you really are already established and you want to do things, you have to up your skills and put them in many places. So this is kind of the ombuds versus the mediator. Anybody who's an ombuds, and I'm sure they're ombuds on this line, they know that they just don't do mediation. They do lots of different things. They negotiate, they do conflict coaching, they facilitate meetings, they investigate. It's really a menagerie of things that they do, right? Mediators can do some of those things also, but once again, as mediators, we're often defined by our identity. So seek opportunities when you may be more of an ombuds, where you can do lots of different things rather than just the one thing of being a mediator. Be prepared to offer skills that function rather than trade on your identity, right? So once again, is that if you come to a situation, you say, well, hire me, I'm a mediator. That may not be as good as saying, hire me, these are the things that I can do for you, right? And the things I can do for you is mediate, facilitate, and this is where you use them, right? Don't assume that somebody knows what mediation is all about and what you can do in mediation, right? You really have to always be educating. So be prepared to think of yourself that way. Training, but not too much. One of the things that I am concerned about in the field is that we do a lot of training, and training is a good thing, but often we train to excess and don't find the opportunities to apply what it is that we're being trained in. We've all gone to trainings and said, boy, the last 20 or 40 hours of the weekend was the greatest thing I've done. And then we go back to the office and we never use any of it. We never use any of it because often the trainers, unfortunately, don't help us in figuring out how to use it, I must tell you. They don't give us those applications. There is no business out there, right? But then we just kind of get wrapped up in what we were doing and we do things the same way that we always did, right? So training is good, but we always have to think, is there a practical, immediate, and realistic application before you decide to go to training? Just because it sounds really cool and you want to do it and everybody's doing it, doesn't mean you drop down $3,000 to take a couple weekends in training without really thinking it through how you're going to use it. Go beyond techniques. This helps with the hammer issue. And what I'm really often saying here is that you really have to think about going back to school, right? Going beyond techniques. Techniques, good. Techniques are really important. But techniques don't really drive how and why you're using techniques. So understanding the underlying nature and theories of conflict, peace, and social justice, in other words, go back to school, can be useful. And you figuring out that maybe it's not the hammer that I need to be using. Maybe it's something else because what's being asked for and called for is something different. Be entrepreneurial. So this, I think, has got the most potential, and it's the thing we do the least. Identify a problem and challenge and put together a proposal. Don't wait for people to come to you. Find something that's going on. You see something in the news, you call that organization that's going through some distress. You see a challenge, you see something in the science field, you see something, you go to them and you say, look, I can do these things, I can help you. Here's a proposal for you to think about. Maybe they'll bring you in as a volunteer, maybe they'll pay you something. But what it does, it's opening up your skill sets to something else. Don't wait for people to come to you. You've got to go out and put yourself out there. Be a good educator first and a salesperson second. We are all teachers. And I think quite often mediators they kind of assume that you know what to do with what I'm selling. It's like, I'm selling you a vacuum cleaner. You know what a vacuum cleaner is. I don't have to explain to you that vacuum cleaners vacuum floors and carpets and furniture and these. They know what a vacuum cleaner does. Okay, I'm a mediator. You know what a mediator does. Now I want you to buy me as the mediator. But I don't know what a mediator does. I don't know what a conflict resolver does. So we really have to be more emphasis on the teaching of people of how we can help what they do, rather than trying to sell who we are and what we do. Right? And I think that's difficult at times because teaching takes a different skill set and often takes different strategies and often is longer. We have to bring people along, right? It's not about selling, it's about educating people. Network, but not with other mediators. I'm not saying this is great, this getting together is wonderful and I don't want you not to do it, but you're not going to get business from other mediators, right? Not finding business, you should be at the Rotary meeting. You should be at the Chamber of Commerce. You should be at places that, have what mediators can do and people can do. not places where it's the same of you all the time. I mean, and that's great. I mean, I'm not saying that didn't happen. I've been to mediations where conference people say, well, I've got too much work. Could you take this case? And that, yeah, I know that happens. But in a sense, it becomes a little bit incestuous at times. We have to figure out how to get in other spaces so that we can show people what we do and so that they can see the value of what they do, right? And, social justice gatherings, business gatherings, educational gatherings, science conventions, think about the other things that you're interested in being in those types of spaces, right? One other slide, and then we can go to questions. And I think we've gotten about 20 minutes of my talking in here is that about 2 years ago, Julie Shedd is the associate director at the Carter School at George Mason, and I were co-editors of this edition of AC Resolution. I know many of you are on the New York chapter and you might not be involved in the national chapter. I'm very involved in the national organization. In fact, I was ready to go to Orlando this year. Of course, no one's going to Orlando for the conference, and I'm co-chair of the education and training section. So we co-edited an edition on careers. And we looked at, one is kind of the trend lines of what's going on. That is the types of places and spaces that conflict resolution people should find themselves in the future, looking at the future. But also thinking about what our field constitutes. It's very interesting that I recognize, because I deal with a lot of young 28-year-old, 29-year-old master's degree students who are coming into the field. And that's a very different generation than I was. I was part of the generation, like many of you, that said, being a lawyer is not cutting it, right? This is not working for me. It's not working for what I want to do. My heart says there's another way of doing it. So then I got mediation training. So I'm a reformed lawyer. Many of us are reformed lawyers, right? And so we said, this is another way of doing it. And there are reformed social workers and psychologists and so forth who've gone in that process also. But what you're seeing more and more today is that you're seeing this other cadre that really started maybe 20 years ago of young people that are drawn first to conflict, not to a field of lawyering or whatever. They're in this field where they want to make the change. So they're not coming in with the professional context that some of us who are lawyers have, as much as a desire from a master's degree level to engage in conflict. And that really sets up different expectations. You find that the master's degree students come to the table often with really deep understanding of the levels and nature of conflict, but don't have the skills, because master's degree programs are not designed to teach you the skills. So there are people who want to come to it, but they're not getting that 40-hour training that we got. We got the 48-hour training, but we don't have the deep understanding of conflict. So how do you bring that together as a community to go forward and doing good work? So we talk about some of those things in that edition. And then finally, here's my contact information if you want to contact me. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, if that's okay, because that's the end of it, the end of my PowerPoint. And yeah, screen share shop. So windows closed. Thank you, Maria. And then if folks have questions about anything that I mentioned, anything they want to disagree with, we're great disagreeers. That's what we do in conflict, put it out there. Or things that are going on in their space, things that I haven't talked about that you're curious about, I'm open. So I think somebody's managing the hands, so we can kind of go there.
David, thank you. One person specifically has asked if you would be willing to share the Letterbox slide again.
Yeah. Again? Show it again?
Or maybe send it to Maria and she can distribute it.
Yeah, I will send the whole PowerPoint to Maria, so you can distribute it, and that's fine. You know, I've got permission to use the Letterbox slide, so you can share it out. So
someone else has asked for you to please post your contact information again. So that's affirmation.
Okay, so I'll do that at the very end, okay?
Great.
And put that out there at the very end.
Okay, and let's see, other questions. We have Lou Blanchard. She's in Utica, New York, and she has a question. Lou, unmute yourself if you are unmuted.
Hi, Lou.
I did. Thank you. Hi, David. Thank you. It was very interesting. You mentioned a book, Drive, about boundary crossers, but I did not catch the author.
So it's Daniel Pink, but his point about boundary crossers might not be from that book. It might be from the book A Whole New Mind. He's got 4 or 5 books. So I'm not sure which one that comes from. Drive,
Okay.
though, Drive is one of the things that I really focus on in my own work, and Pink talks about this work also, is finding meaning in our work. We're not doing this work unless we're finding meaning, and he talks about that. And he talks about this necessity of boundary crossers. So it's one of those books. Yeah.
All right,
Drive.
thank you.
Harvey Simon in New York has a question.
Harvey, nice to meet you.
Harvey Simon, yeah, unmute. Harvey, you're muted. Maybe you're gone. No, yeah, you're still muted. Hang on, unmute. Wait a minute. Let me see if I can. Maria, can
I
you
think I'm
unmute?
unmuted.
There you are, Harvey. I
There
see
he
you.
is.
I got you.
Terrific. My question, greetings, folks. David, I'm resonating with your presentation.
Thank you.
My question is, initially, how does one create a desire to negotiate in the first place? I find it easy when people want to resolve. I find it difficult when everybody doesn't want to resolve.
Yeah, I mean, my own experience as a mediator has been that showing alternatives and what, you know, I think mediators have to have good stories, right? Of course, we always have confidentiality we deal with, but having stories in our back pocket that we can show people who might have not negotiated and what ended up happening, I think is very incentivizing for people. So one of the things that I have found is where people don't want to negotiate, and often people don't want to negotiate for various reasons. You know, people are not particularly logical. They're emotional, right? And you don't want to negotiate with somebody that you have an emotional despise for, right? So often that type of overcoming an emotional bias is maybe beyond our wheelhouse sometimes. We have to recognize that, you know, that's why therapists are really important for mediators, because if the wife doesn't want to negotiate with the husband because of something else there, it may not be something that we can do. But where there's some rationality in the inability to want to negotiate, showing them alternatives where they don't, maybe based on our own stories, may be enough to incentivize them to go into negotiation.
Sounds good as a motivator. Also, may I offer a suggestion?
Sure.
When we talk about peace, I think we really mean safety. And where you use the term peace, I would use the term safety, because I don't think you can have peace without safety.
Yeah,
I think. Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No. Please finish, because I agree with you.
I was just thinking that safety itself may be the point of operationalization for this consensus. What we're trying to build is a safety zone so people can get on with the rest of their lives that they haven't been able to before.
I think sometimes we think about safety in terms of, we kind of equate it to criminal justice, right? We kind of we're safe from, but that's not the safety we mean. We mean food security, emotional safety, psychological safety.
Or physical safety.
Physical, yeah, but it is physical safety, but there's more than, I would go beyond the physical safety. If I think about physical safety, I think about, you know, am I safe in my community? But increasingly, we're looking at psychological safetiness, right? That is being in a situation where we're feeling we're not being attacked or oppressed. That's also a notion of safety also. So I agree with you, Harvey. We have to more broadly consider what safety is sometimes.
And I agree with that too, but none of that can happen without physical safety.
Right. That's important. Security, I mean, doing international work, you can't do anything else in a conflict zone until you create some safe space for people to operate in. Yeah.
There it is, that safety zone that needs to be.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. Thank you, David.
Thank you,
and
Harvey.
thank you for ADR. I'm very, very enthused. I have an MPA. I'm a retired policy analyst, and you've given me a 5th or 6th lifetime.
Great.
Thank you.
That was the whole point. Listen, you guys, we set up some guidelines at the beginning of the session, and we said, would you please raise your hands rather than using the chat section? Now I see that there are a few questions in the chat session, and I'm going to articulate them or call on you, but better you should go to put your hand over your image. Up will come the three dots, which stands for a menu option. And click on the three dots, and then you can raise your hand. Otherwise, we are going to be bouncing back and forth between chat and questions. Here's one from Jeanette, who says, how would you utilize conflict resolution to reduce mass incarceration and assist justice-involved individuals?
Yeah, and I think that's the question of the day, right? One of the things we're thinking about is the totality of reforms that we can, and maybe it's not always reforming, because there's a lot of argument that reforming hasn't worked in broadly our criminal justice situation, from policing to incarceration and so forth. I think one of the things to recognize is that you have to look at who the stakeholders are in the criminal justice. If you're looking, for instance, in incarceration, you have policy people, you have the administrators, you have the people who are incarcerated, you have different constituencies there, and you have greater society and what they're trying to accomplish through incarceration, which is often been in question about whether they play a role in that. Often we don't ask greater society, what is it that you're trying to achieve in incarcerating people? So often what conflict resolution people have to do is raise those questions, recognizing that there's going to be conflict from the answers of those questions. So one of the things that I would say is that what is our role in raising the debate in what is the motivation behind incarceration in a particular circumstance, and being able to facilitate that conversation, right? The other is then looking at maybe, say, the population of those people who are incarcerated and whether the effect that we believe we're actually having. So where can we have the conversation with the people who are inside, in a sense, and talking to them and saying, is the effect, the intended effect of what the policymakers are having, are things that are really the outcomes? How do we raise and facilitate that conversation also? One of the things would be interesting is finding, and I suspect we might find this, is that what the intentions of the policymakers and even the public at times is not really what the outcome is coming out in people who are incarcerated. So how do we get involved and raise those conversations?
Okay, we've got several comments about both racial and religious discrimination. One is asking that we not use the term Indian chief.
Okay.
In anti-racism.
It's from a song, so it was really used as a metaphor, but I do appreciate that.
Okay.
Yeah.
But two people commented on it. We've got a very alert, sensitive group here.
I appreciate, I apologize for that.
Thank you. Always from India has a long comment. We notice a trend in India in many schools that plenty of children engage in religious bigotry and conflict. Can we introduce and train children and prepare them to be engaged in peace building?
So the question is, how do we engage children in peace building? Is that really, give me the kind of the question.
Yes.
Yeah, the question is that. So one of the things that I often think about is that there's indirect and direct ways in which we engage young people in the process of peace building. And it's often the indirect ways that we're not cognizant of and the benefits of them, right? So for instance, we spend a lot of time, I believe in peer mediation programs. I've worked on some of them. I think they're very important. Often they're not necessarily in the right places. That is, some of the schools that need them can't support them and so forth. But one of the things that I recognize is that it's the normal course of what young people do that the ability to deal with conflict exists, right? So for instance, I think about athletics and sports, right? The ability of working on a team, playing by the rules, fair play, those types of things. Being in certain types of projects, right? The things that we can do that are really part of the day-to-day work of maybe educators, but people who work with youth, that really allow us to allow them to learn and for us to model, right, the better ways of engaging. We have to be more intentional about that. And sometimes we aren't so intentional about it. We just do it because it's something we're supposed to do without recognizing that there are really important lessons that come from it. So think about the non-intended ways in which we work with young people and think about them more.
Here's another one from Tom Hastings. He says,
Hey,
some
Tom.
of us are working to develop a citizen's response to assure a peaceful transition of power next January. Let's hope there's a transition. Sorry, that's my comment. I hope all of us in conflict resolution are thinking about this and doing ahead of time what we can do to avoid some national meltdown. Tom, do you want to speak to this?
Yeah, sure.
Hey, Tom, nice to see you.
Well, you too, David, and I appreciate everything that you're doing here. And I'm looking forward to the recording of this at some point because I want to share this with all of my students. I have about 300 students a year go through various courses that relate to us, of course, and there is a growing sense in my community in Portland, Oregon, that this is something we need to do. And a very gifted young a professional project manager, originally from Venezuela, initiated this locally. So I'm trying to draw in people to help her develop a toolkit. But it just seems to me we've got aspects of this that along with every other sort of conflict management, and you've alluded to it too, David, is that the further upstream we can get in reducing grievances and all the other things that we should be doing ahead of time, the more effective we can be in avoiding blow-ups and meltdowns. So this seems to me to be incredibly important right now for us as a field to come to grips with this, to think about it and to start networking together about it. I've been told by friends in DC that if we can develop a model, it will go viral. So I'm hoping that we can think about this as a field. This is going to be coming upon us faster than we can even imagine.
Right. Timing is everything, Tom. I agree with you. Right. Yeah. The moment.
Prathamish makes a comment that when you specialize, you lose the opportunity for creative thinking. Mark Kleiman has had his hand raised for a long time. He's been frustrated. Sorry, I apologize to all of you because I'm bouncing back and forth between two screens.
I just want to make sure people can think about what Tom has said a little bit. That's what I want to make sure and maybe share with them, because I also think timing is everything, and we are at this moment. Sometimes we are not prepared for the moment. Sometimes the moment passes and I wish I coulda, shoulda kind of thing. And we can't do that right now. There are too many things in force, from the national politics to looking at policing and oppression in our communities, to certainly the existential crisis of pandemic, of coronavirus, all come together. That what is it, the role that we can play? And what Tom was saying about working upstream, that's always been hard for us. We always seem to be the downstream people, right? It's hard for us to get into to cross the policy Rubicon, to be on the other side. How do we do that, I think, is one of the questions that we really need to struggle with. So anyhow, I just want to be able to give
you want to comment?
No. If Tom wants to say something, but I just wanted to be able to.
Oh, I know, I'm kidding.
To build out a little bit what Tom was saying. So go ahead.
Great,
go ahead,
wonderful. Okay, Mark Kleiman.
Yes, actually, what I have to say is very relevant exactly to that. Recent experience in the political arena on a community level has exposed me to a couple of not only so much approaches, but approaches that move our skills into the area of persuasion, as well as quote conflict resolution. And I'm sure that our speaker knows about the Center for Community Change in DC that developed Anat Sheckman Osorio, and she has approach called the race class narrative, and how to persuade people, in this polarized society by using some of these skills of leading with the values, identifying the obstructor, and talking about the aspirations in order to move those who are independents over. The other area that you mentioned also was intersectionality, and this woman, Kimberly Crenshaw, who has done really some brilliant work in that whole area as it relates particularly to race, but applications to everything else, where I think I look at it as an analytical tool that lets you tease out the issues that come to bear on whatever the issue is. And race is one of the is a primary one that she deals with. So I have found it to really be liberating to see myself as a mediator now able to utilize these skills and the power of these skills of values and aspirations that we use as mediators into impacting the way people view things as they struggle to find a political direction.
That's really important, Mark, and that's a good example of where you can do that kind of work. So thank you.
Susan Cushman.
Oh, hi, Susan. How are you?
Hi, David. So good to see you. Thanks so much for your presentation.
You too.
Yeah. So first of all, I can't say enough good things about Peace Jobs. This is a book that I've used in the classroom, as David knows. And I'm one of those perhaps more of the natural types that don't, my question for David may be different from those of the rest of you being mediators and attorneys. I'm a community college instructor. I teach at Nassau Community College, mainly humanities and literature courses. But I did develop a peace studies course for my college. And so, the ubiquity of this message that David, his thesis about ubiquity and about kind of casting the net wide, I think is really valuable for folks outside of the mediation field as well. But my question, comes, David, when you were listing your suggestions and you talked about, you said something that I thought was great about that training should have an emphasis on practicality and what skill set we can teach or that we can bring to the conflict or the situation rather than who we are. And I think that's been so valuable for my students to learn the peace building skills, the history of peace building, et cetera. And then, that I've done some applied learning where I've actually gotten some kids out the door to Long Island Dispute Resolution Center, where the experts can teach them better than I, right? But I'm giving them sort of the foundation. But my question for you, David, and this really might be applicable to others who are building in this field in their institutions. At the community college, they really want the students to be someone or to have a certification that, like a paralegal certification, where they can where it's a technicality. They've got the degree and they can go out and be someone or do something. So how do we reconcile that, more of your wide net and your ubiquity with the practical needs of the college?
So one of the things I would say is community colleges, and Susan and I know how much love that I have for community colleges, and that I taught for one many years, is, a good 45 to 50% of American undergraduates are in community colleges. They are democracy's colleges. These are not elite institutions. These are institutions that represent the broad spectrum of Americans, many young people who go to college who are undocumented and are first generation and so forth. And, they're the ones that really need to be empowered in order to make change in these skills. I think that in community colleges and in colleges as a whole, there is this need. The big emphasis is credentialing, right? So this idea that when you graduate from an educational institution, higher education, and one of the things I want to say is that we're also starting, we cannot not recognize that higher education is not everyone's pathway, even to our work necessarily, right? And that we have a society where we might suggest that higher education should be the goal of everyone. And it's not the goal of everyone, nor should it be the goal for everyone. Often community colleges are good middle grounds for people who want some higher education, but don't want to be in the high ivory tower. So having some credentialing becomes really important. And what I really argue is that so for instance, for community colleges, for instance, is making sure that the broader way of curriculum, I've dealt with I'm trying to think, welding programs in community colleges, and trying to help teachers who teach welding how to incorporate conflict resolution notions into their curriculum, and how that they can empower welders, graduates who just get a certification, not necessarily a degree, but very useful and allows them to make a good living, on how to deal with differences in the workplace, and how to deal with conflict. So I don't know if this is answering your question, Susan, but this idea that it really needs to be in all of these different fields that are not necessarily the ivory tower type fields.
Got you. Yeah, we're working right now on guided pathways, and I'm trying to get into that committee where I can sort of convey your thesis, and the brilliance of it, and the need for it.
Thank you.
In society today.
Okay, thank you, Susan.
Thank you, Susan.
Alan Marks has a question.
Alan?
Maybe
Alan,
he
you
gave
need to
up.
unmute.
He's Alan.
On,
Alan,
okay, can you?
There he is. There he is.
there you are. Okay.
Okay, so my question involves something you said about young children teaching.
I'm not. It's not audible. I'm sorry, Alan.
Let me see if I can make it louder.
Okay, it just was going in and out.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Okay, so you talked about education. You talked about socialization, children learning how to play by the rules in sports and things of that nature. And it seems to me, people have been talking a lot with what's going on about systematic problems, about societal systematic problems. And I'm wondering how you resolve, or if you have any ideas of how to resolve, which to me is the big question, the idea between those people who see, I was a teacher, and many times it was the higher your education, the more money you make. Everything is attached to money that you make. And to me, teaching was a humanitarian endeavor. And for people who see that they can make more money if they sacrifice their humanitarian instincts, to see the idea of winning is everything. It's not how you play the game. It's winning is everything, which seems to be built into the society, and not just in the United States, but around the world. The more money you make, the more important it is. And this seems to be almost an obstruction towards resolving conflict, in my mind. How do you make that kind of fundamental shift when there are so many people who are playing on the other side of the field, and that is, as long as I'm the richest man, I can separate myself from people and avoid conflict completely. I don't even have to deal with them.
Well, one of the things is, I think where you start is recognizing that it's a structure or systemic issue, right? It's the values that are very, very deeply ingrained in Americans that, for us to, and I'm not meaning to generalize, but there might be some societies around the world that are more collaborative than American society. There's a lot of leadership programs in the United States, but not a whole lot of followership programs. People don't know how to work in a team. Everybody wants to be the leader. Everybody wants to win. Everybody wants to be in charge. Now, I may be overstating the case a bit, but that's part of it. And there are not easy things that you can do to rectify that, right? You have to go deep into the American psyche and the American experience and unbottle some of the myths that we have about who Americans are and what Americans do in order to do some corrective action to that. And a lot of it now is focusing on the oppression of African Americans and the fact that we wanted, winning at some point meant controlling other people, right? And that's how we got about doing it. So I think part of it is recognizing it, first of all. So the other question is, well, where do we start? Well, we have to start at different levels. And people would always make the case, and I still agree with it, is that you start with young children who are very young. But one of the things that I recognize about education is that education is holistic, right? So what teachers do in the classroom, very good teachers can be eradicated in 15 minutes when they get home. unfortunately. That is, a lot of the good things that teachers do with their students, once the kids walk into the door, it's all poof. And next day, the teacher doesn't recognize they're starting from zero. So what is it that you can actually do within family structures, within family situations, right? Because kids come from families look very different, but it's all constituted of a family. What you can do there in order to change how people view this notion of winning and the values of collaboration. Part of it is making the emotional case for it. Often we're really big at making, we'll say, the logical and the metrics case for collaboration. You know, we all have the statistics about, you know, you get more when you collaborate, you can make more money, and you do more of this, you do more. It's still a winning thing when it comes down to it. Right. How do we make the emotional argument that collaboration is better, is a better way of doing things than this notion of winning and competitiveness?
It's interesting. I don't want to interrupt, but it's interesting because businesses now state that collaboration is one of the most important things. But then again, it's always fed back into the idea of the more you can collaborate, the more you'll fit into the business, the more money you'll make.
Right.
It's so ingrained, and not just in America, you say American society, I think the whole world is built around this model of the more successful you are, the more material reward you will get. And the idea of having an ethical, moral, humanitarian, spiritual reward is so much further away from where exactly what we're talking about. Yeah. It's so much further away from that. So you're working against all of the aspects, not just, and I agree with you, you have to take them on one at a time, but it's like trying to whack, what's that called? Whack-a-mole?
Whack-a-mole.
That's what it feels like.
Yeah, yeah. I agree with you. It is a little bit like whack-a-mole, and it is something that we always have to be constant about. And I wish I had a really pronounced strategy and some great ways of doing it. It's small things in big ways is all we can do.
That's exactly what your talk is about.
Yeah, yeah.
All right. It is 10 o'clock. I would like to end this with a comment from Tom Hastings, which speaks to what you two have just been discussing. He says, my Nepali granddaughter, aged 6, is reading kids about diversity and inclusion. She's a tiny person, maybe 40 pounds, and she's becoming a little expert and developing a sharp sense of justice and assertive power. I hope parents and elementary school teachers can take the initiative to promote this early education. Listen, David, thank you very much. Lots of questions here. Lots of thank yous to you. And thanks for putting your screen back up.
Yeah, there's my contact information. Yeah.
And
No,
it was terrific.
And I wish everybody a good 4th of July. Do some time to reflect this weekend. There's a lot going on in this country. And if we're not going to go to fireworks and barbecues, let's do some reflection, thinking about where our country is, particularly in terms of social justice and the oppression of many fellow Americans. Use that as that space to do and what we can do about that, right?
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
David, thank you. Thank you all for joining. Very good holidays to everybody.
Bye, y'all.
Bye-bye.